Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully, we'll have a few more members join us as the workshop gets underway. Today, we're following up on a CAC members' request to have a presentation by our member, Mr. Hollenkamp, regarding the fiscal impact analysis, principally of Plant City, but I think it's going to cover some other ground. I don't know that we need to go around and identify Rich who's on the line, since we're not going to be taking a vote. So with that, I think I'll turn the meeting over to Steve Hollenkamp and let him introduce the format and our guests. Go ahead, Steve.
So first, sorry,
Yes.
The first person on the agenda is actually Yasser, but Steve, go ahead and you can start us off.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Rich. Thank you all for joining. Just about every city and county in America has expenses that exceed their revenues. Just about every city and county in the state of Florida doesn't have enough money coming in to cover all of their costs. And every year, costs that cannot be afforded get pushed off and added to the backlog, which grows and grows and grows. If anybody has if anyone's still has their microphone on, please turn that off because we're hearing a few people come through. Hillsborough County is no different. Plant City is no different. Plant City is better than any city I've ever looked at or heard of this analysis done on. Plant City looks very good in relation to other cities, but Plant City also has its own annual resource gap to address. Many cities and counties across the country are realizing they must be doing something wrong, and that maybe the problem is their growth strategy and their approach to transportation and land use, and they're turning to more rigorous fiscal analyses to figure out what types of developments pay for themselves and what types do not. When done right, fiscal analysis can be the tool our decision makers need to dig our cities and counties out of their fiscal deficits. The topic today is to discuss the right approach versus the wrong approach, and hopefully we can find common ground and influence our MPO to use more modern approaches to fiscal analysis. To join in the conversation today, we're in luck to have some awesome people. We have some members from the consulting group Urban 3 who are at the forefront of fiscal analysis nationally. Kate and Josh are from Urban 3, and they can help answer all questions as well as show us what they do and what the core takeaways are of the analysis they've done for countless cities across the US. Verdunity is another consulting group. They're doing amazing work. They were scheduled to be on the call today. I was super pumped, and anyone that knows Verdunity would have been pumped because they're brilliant guys. But unfortunately, something came up and they backed out yesterday and can no longer be with us. We're first going to start with Yassert. We're going to hear an overview of fiscal analysis from him. Then, as Rich reminded me numerous times, this workshop is set up to dive deeper into my fiscal analysis on Plant City. So we'll review that before getting to Kate and Josh, and then we'll have an open discussion. And with that, I will turn things over to Yassert.
Yes, indeed. Good afternoon or evening, as you prefer. It's getting quite dark here due to the incoming storm. I hope this finds you hale and hearty, as they say. I'm just going to do a very abbreviated introduction for anybody that really has not had contact with this, with this concept, have not encountered in their professional life, either present or past. So, and again, it's only a couple of slides, and then again, there will be other presenters, as Mr. Hollenkamp has said. So once again, this is Yasser Gonzalez, staff with the Planning Commission. I am actually the manager of economics, research, and demographics for the Planning Commission. I'm in the strategic planning, economics, environmental research for the Planning Commission. So again, this is just a primer on the fiscal impact analysis, just an overview. First, we're going to go into a background, and the background will include some long-term projections that we do. Then why do we do fiscal analysis? Fiscal impact analysis. Why would we do something like that? Then the definition, and then what are the the goods and some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks of it. and some conclusions. And again, this is a very abbreviated. I'm sure the speakers that follow will go into more depth into what they, into more complicated things. So again, planners, I'm in the Planning Commission of Hillsborough County, and we're projecting 2 million residents by 2045. That's an additional 600,000 residents from now towards that year. But then that growth is a good to have. I mean, many communities would love to have that kind of growth, but it impacts budgets, whether it's a city budget or a county budget. And staff within that city or county will be striving to measure this impact and then either counteract the impact or enhance it. It depends on whether it's a good or bad. There are many tools available, many methods available, and you will see some very fancy ones right now after I will follow my address here. And the county, for example, has hired Tischler Bice to develop a fiscal model. And again, that's a very Excel-driven model, and it's a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of data going in there. They have interviewed all sorts of department heads, so it's very detailed and tailored model the county is going to be using. So that's one example of how you can go about it. Again, this graph just shows you growth in terms of jobs and population. Just an additional 600,000 people are going to be expected to 2045. Jobs are 1.3 million jobs, and all those who require places to eat, places to live, roads, libraries, parks, etc. So these are the things that county managers need to wrestle with, as we come with this development. So why do we do this analysis? Again, the fiscal impact analysis. There are two main drivers, and of course, the speakers that will follow will go into other drivers. But in our view, will be two main drivers: fairness. That's the first thing, and this is taken some of the text in the slides taken from the Hillsborough Comprehensive Plan. So the first one is the fairness. We want to make sure that future residents pay for a portion of the infrastructure that they're going to be using. So that's so you will not only rely on existing residents to pay for future growth. So there will be like a sharing of the cost of development. And the second one is to maintain or improve a level of service. So the county has to always be vigilant that in areas of the county, you don't see a degradation of the level of service. So we maintain as much as practicable the level of service throughout the county. For the city, for example, of Plan City, what we have here is that the city does usually in its comprehensive plan has something called factor economic considerations whenever they are assessing new development. Typically, the city will assess it in a qualitative basis. It's a small city; they don't really have economists on staff, so that's what the best they can do usually. However, to give an example of the Planned City, South Planned City annexation, that one, a study is being conducted. And one of the recommendations that we've made as a planning commission to the city is to have their consultants do a fiscal impact analysis. So for those larger annexations, for those larger projects, the city may engage consulting services in order to get into the fancier models, more of the detailed models. So again, this is just it's different approaches. County will hire consulting teams and will have them develop models. The city typically qualitative assessment, but if the project is large enough, they may hire consultants as well. This tool, what is this tool? Is this a new tool? No, it's not. It's been around since the 1970s. Now you see very fancy models going, following me, and those are maybe of late that incorporate georeference, GIS and all that. Of course, that's more late, but the tool has been in function since the 1970s. And again, what does this analysis do? It takes an estimate. Again, it's an estimate of or projection of public costs and revenues from private development. So that's what you want to do. So when somebody wants to develop a piece of land, a large piece of land, or even a small piece of land, what are the costs or revenues that come in? Which again, the budget managers or the county budget managers or the city budget managers can then use those numbers and feed them into their models. Revenues like property taxes or sales taxes, and costs like roads, parks, etc. Again, we cannot emphasize that there's quantitative approaches and there's also qualitative approaches. So those are two things. And typically, if it is a standalone model, fiscal impact analysis model, it will be scalable. You can analyze a single project or the entire jurisdiction going forward. So that's usually what happens. What are the benefits and costs? So the first benefit is, which has been said before, is that the planners project this large number of people. What does that mean to the budget managers? Then it links the two. This analysis links the two. Also, for the budget managers, it increases certainty. They are often planning for budgets in the future. This results from this analysis increases future certainty of budgets. It adds facts and figures to the discussion. Like, now there's a lot of passions around development. This brings facts and figures to the discussion and hopefully makes the discussion more civil and more productive. And of course, it's transparency. Like you will see what assumptions they made and how they use them. What are the typical costs of this? You have staff costs. So you will have either economists on staff, so that those are staff costs. And also you have additional consulting costs if you don't really have them. So those are the typical costs. What are the caveats that we're looking for here? The caveats that we're looking for here as a person that's trying to understand this is that, like any modeling, any kind of economic and financial modeling, the assumptions matter. And the results are not final, and they're not the final word. You do remember that development and developing of properties is a public process that takes, the give and take of a public process. So this is not dictating solutions. This is just providing, again, an aid in decision making. A lot of the projects that have positive impacts are not all good, and vice versa. A lot of the projects that have negative, impacts on the budget are not all bad, because it needs to be looked upon in the framework of what does the community want to see in the community in the future. And sometimes some of those impacts are temporary, some of them are long-term, some projects start positive and negative, some start negative and then positive, so it's different. And people, what is a revenue neutral project? Revenue neutrality is a bit elusive. So that is something that, although you want to achieve that, although you may want it's a worthy goal, but you have to be realistic, that may not always be achieved. To conclude this very brief presentation, the planners have spoken and said 2 million people by 2045, an additional 600,000 people. But what does that mean for the county managers or city managers? That means that there will be budget impacts. They need something to estimate this impact and see how that fits into their view, into their future. So some cities like the county has engaged consultants, and Plan City has a hybrid approach. They may just do a qualitative assessment, or they may engage consulting teams as the need arises. So that's it. And what we like to say here is that fiscal impact analysis does not settle the debate of development. It's a good to develop, it's a bad to develop, but it informs, we hope, the debate to develop or to integrate a piece of property to development plans. Any questions?
Any questions from the committee at this point? I have one quick question, Mr. Gonzalez. In your projections, are you showing that the population of the county will grow by 2 million by 2045, or it will reach 2 million by 2045?
Yes, hello. Thank you for pointing that out. It will reach 2 million by 2045, which means an additional 600,000 residents by 2045.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Good.
Chair?
Thank you.
Chair?
Thank you also.
Chair, this is Rick Fernandez. May I ask a question before Mr. Gonzalez takes off?
Of course, Mr. Fernandez is recognized.
Thanks. Hey, everybody. Let me just throw my face up here. So I don't know if you can, if it doesn't matter. Mr. Gonzalez, hey, I don't know if you can see me or not, but I'm wearing a hat and I look a little sleepy, so you can just deal with that visual.
No,
Let me just spin off of what Chair just asked about the numbers, because we hear those numbers tossed out all the time, and people just accept them as a given. And I've never really understood the foundation for that projection. There are so many unknowns, and you're going out to 2045. So what are the assumptions beyond just pulling a number out of the air? What are the assumptions that get us there when I'm 90 years old?
In a nutshell, it's a fairly sophisticated modeling for projecting. First thing, we looked at development trends. How many houses have been put on the ground, let's say in the last 10 years. Then we're looking at typical densities for those, for different land use types. And then we're looking at a typical household, what is happening to person per household, person per house. So we look at that, and then we come up with that. We go this. Remember, this have been vetted. We have gone. These projections are done at the SaaS level, which is like a neighborhood type of neighborhood. Like so they have been vetted. So we go say to Mama, we go to South County, we go to Northwest Hillsborough, we go to the city, and we go to them and say, this is what we're projecting. What do you guys think? And through that feedback, we may increase, decrease projections, our numbers, and then we release them after that. So again, it's the issue with projections is there are a snapshot in time. What we do know is that we will grow, even though now we may think, oh, those things are off. Remember, back in the Great Recession, everybody predicted doom and gloom, and look at what happened in the last in the in between years. So with this, it will be similar. There will be a dip of some sort, and we will expect to continue growing because the fundamentals, as they say, in the finance, are very strong for Florida in terms of like growth.
May I ask another follow-up question to that, Chair?
Please.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. As I hear that, I'm sort of left with a feeling that we are a metro area that is being acted upon rather than, taking responsible action and to a degree, at least, charting our own course. So I'm curious, are there certain variables attendant to questions, say, of our comp plan, just to pull a word or a phrase out of the air? Are there things that we could be doing with our comp plan that will in some way impact the projections that you are raising? For instance, do we want, if we looked at more restrictions in terms of development in the outside of the urban service boundary, in the rural, limit how much we're doing out there? If we talk about more density in the urban service boundary, that it's one thing to make projections based upon what we're doing today, but I'm not altogether sure that what we're doing today is right, number one, and number two, that it's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. So where are those variables adjustable, and what is it that we can do to control our own fate?
Yes, and again, great question. Thank you for asking. The first thing is that every parcel in the county has a so-called future land use designation. And that's another element that has been vetted by the public and by the planning commission, by the commissioners, by different bodies. So that drives the growth. So in your case, we'll say outside the urban service area, we will have X number of X amount of density, Because of that, if we change that, the projections will need to be changed. So let's say next time we do the projections, we will look at the future land use designations that are being there, that have been negotiated and and vetted by different groups and and requested by developers themselves, and we will make adjustments. Now, what are the things that we could do that we're already doing to either shape growth or kind of position growth? Now, we know they're coming, but we have a say in where will they potentially live, right? Because, for example, we have this urban service area, right? So it would be easier for a developer to develop or redevelop something inside the urban service area than outside of it. And that's by design, because we have made a decision that outside the urban service area, we wanted to have a different character, more rural. We want to be able to preserve agriculture outside there. So that's what we're doing. So that's one thing. We also, again, for the densities, as you said, if we're seeing that, through the future land use, we may change densities, so we may make downtown even more dense. We may, allow different types of build, in certain areas that are different, like single family to buildings. We can do a lot of things, and we are doing them. When you're looking at the future, the future land use and at the comprehensive plans, you will see visions that have been vetted and that have the stakeholders have participated, whether it's civic stakeholders, nonprofit businesses, and they have themselves left their imprimatur, if you will, on it. So we are doing that again. Through these restrictions, in a way, the development, we sort of control where people actually end up living. And so far, development shows, I mean, we're seeing typical, the urban service area will grow faster than the outside the urban service area, for example. The jurisdictions will grow faster. So then, so it's not as although it may look chaotic, when you run the trends, it's actually a method to the madness, or a madness to the method, if you will.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave you alone now. Thanks.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I might elaborate, my name is Sean College and I work with Yassert Gonzalez. With your permission, if I could elaborate on that answer, I'd appreciate it.
I'll be happy to have your comments, but I don't want to get the workshop off its primary subject of fiscal analysis and talk about population growth. So go ahead.
Yes, I'll be very brief. Very brief. Just to what Yassert described on the first question was correct in that we allocate the population. The total number, though, countywide comes from the Bureau of Business and Economic Research. That's where that number comes from. They estimated, and it's based largely on historic trends, and it's proven to be fairly accurate historically. And then on the second question about how we influence that, what happens in Plant City, in and around Plant City or different parts of the county, is adjusted based on the comprehensive plan and what we think is going to happen in investments with infrastructure and where the city, for example, of Plant City wants to locate or develop. So when we develop that number, and there's a specific number for Plant City that was not shown on the screen, we actually met with the staff of Plant City, and we went before the elected city council several times to get their influence and their ideas of where they thought growth was going to occur. So the answer again to Mr. Fernandez's question is yes, you can influence the growth and where it's going to occur and how much is going to be there based on your investment in infrastructure. And when we revise this number in another few years, we will again go to the planners of Plant City and the elected officials and anybody who wants to speak at these public forums to get their input on how they want to see their city develop. Thank you.
Good. Thank you for that input. Okay, Mr. Hollenkamp, you want to move on to the next item on the agenda, which is actually the Plant City fiscal analysis, because I fear we could spend the entire hour talking about population projections and growth trends. So.
All right, well, thank you, Bill. Cheryl, could you please share my screen?
Ah, here we go.
All right, you should be all set.
Okay, how's it looking? You guys seeing?
We lost the multi-screen, the multi-person screen.
Okay, let me try this.
I want to swap the display settings because we're seeing your presenter view.
Okay.
You gotta think it's a poker game. You don't want to reveal your cards. There you go.
How's that, guys?
Yeah.
That's good.
All right. Thank you, Yassert and Sean. As I said, Fraternity was supposed to be on the call to discuss how best to do fiscal impact analysis at the specific project level. They could not make it, but we have another guest that can weigh in on one certain approach. The guest is Justin Weiss. He's the assistant city manager of a city in Texas called Fate, Texas. The method Fate, Texas uses is the private to public investment ratio. Some of you are familiar with this. I'm going to give a quick overview, and then I'm going to ask Justin to weigh in. Justin does not have much time, so we're reviewing this first to work within his schedule. And so you can all ask him questions and find out from somebody that's actually using this approach what it's like for them. So I'll briefly go over the idea first. The idea is this. A developer, let's say, comes to Hillsborough County and says they would like to build 1,000 homes on the outskirts of town. What can we do to understand the fiscal impact of such a project? One option is to spend a whole lot of money on a consultant to dive deep into every cost and every revenue. But this approach is expensive, complicated, and unintuitive. What we need is a simpler heuristic, an intuitive rule of thumb, a back-of-the-napkin approach that could be done by anyone. Something that answers the question with 95% accuracy with very little work. That approach, according to Fate Texas, is the private to public investment ratio. And here's how it works. You take the total private investment of a project, let's say those 1,000 homes, and you multiply it by the target sale price. And you divide that by the total public investment. That is the upfront cost of the dedicated infrastructure. The idea is to understand what the long-term maintenance costs for the city are of infrastructure. It doesn't matter who pays for it up front. The city or county maintains it forever after. To understand those costs and to estimate those costs, we can just look at the initial upfront costs. And so an example would be 1,000 homes at, let's say, $200,000 target home price, and the cost of the roads, curbs, and sidewalks are $10 million. Total private investment would be 1,000 times 200,000, or 200 million, divided by the 10 million, and we get a 20-to-1 private to public investment ratio. Now, what does that mean, 20-to-1 private to public? Well, here's a rubric. According to Fate, 20-to-1 and below, this is not a financially sustainable development. It may make a lot of money up front, but in the long run, the annual inflows do not exceed the annual outflows. If it's 20-to-1 to 40-to-1, now this development is possibly financially sustainable, and 40-to-1 and up, likely financially sustainable. So a way a city could use this rubric is they could say, you know what, we would like to repave our roads every 15 years. We would like to replace our roads every 90 years. So we can use this rubric and look and connect the two and see 24-to-1 is the break-even private to public investment ratio that a new development would need to achieve. And if they're below that, you go back and you say, do better. Or the city could say, is there anything they can do to make the infrastructure requirements less and less costly to up the ratio? And with that, I'd like to, if Cheryl, if you can give Justin a voice here. I'd love to get Justin on to describe his experiences in Fate of actually using this approach, and let us all ask him questions.
Hey everybody, Justin Weiss out here in Fate, Texas. Can you hear me okay? Just show me a thumbs up if you could hear me all right. Awesome. Well, Stephen, great introduction, and I've really enjoyed the conversation up to this point. Mr. Gonzalez, he was talking about how this fiscal impact analysis doesn't tell you what you should do, but it helps influence the decision-making process. And the second thing that I wanted to point out, Mr. Fernandez, you said something about determining your fate. We talk about that all the time here in Fate, Texas. We want to determine our fate here in Fate, Texas. So just wanted to, I know it doesn't get old, but briefly wanted to touch on how we're using this analysis and especially this ratio. You did a great job, Stephen, explaining that. And really what I want to share with y'all is what do we do once we have determined that number? And so in every report that we provide to our Planning and Zoning Commission and every report that we provide to our City Council, we help them understand the impact of any given development in our community. You can actually use this for redevelopment projects. You could use this for the repaving of a road. The way that we kind of try to use it in normal language and make it accessible to our public, because when you start getting into the tens of millions of dollars, when you start talking about the replacement of roads, you're going to lose a lot of people because they're not engineers, and that's okay. Our role as city staff is to make this understandable and accessible to the general public, to where they say, you know what, that makes sense, and maybe I would change the way that I think about development if I understood what it costs to me. The 20-to-1, again, this is kind of a rule of thumb. This is a quick back of napkin, something that we created internally. I think we've shared the spreadsheet with Stephen, and he's taken it to a whole new level. One of the beauty of this process is when it's made simple, it's made accessible. And you can go through a more laborious effort and make this as sophisticated as possible. But I think if we could break it down in just to these small pieces, that then offers the ability to ask additional questions. So when development comes forward and it doesn't meet that 20-to-1 ratio, we ask ourselves, well, why not? And like Stephen was saying, is it because that the value of the development being proposed, is it not high enough? Is the infrastructure too costly? And on those questions start to help inform the decision makers on how do we make this better. Like Stephen was saying, when a development comes in, let's say on the periphery of your town or your city, and they say, look, we've got 1,000 homes and it looks good on paper until you have to pay the replacement costs. Right now in the city of Fate, it costs us about $1,500, and this is on the general fund, to serve every single family home that we have here. We know that because we take our general fund, we divide it by the number of homes that we have, and you get a number that says this is the cost to serve per home. We also know on the flip side of that how much revenue we get per home on average. If you and I were to go into a business deal and I were to tell you, look, it costs us $1,500 to provide this service, and we're only going to get $750 back in revenue, would you go into business with me on that? I highly doubt it. But yet that's the business that we're in as a municipality, trying to provide services for a development pattern that might not make sense. And so again, just kind of in conclusion, this isn't the end-all say-all way to go about doing a fiscal analysis. It's just one component. One last analogy that I would share is, think of it as you're going in for a mortgage, and your lender is going to look at a lot of different financial indicators from your personal balance sheet. They're going to want to know your debt to income ratio. They're going to want to know where your income is coming from. They're going to want to know the nature of your job. All of those things lead to a conclusion that whether that person is credit worthy to receive, so that the bank can receive a return on investment. Once we start talking about a return on investment for infrastructure for communities, then we can have those conversations about what is that ratio? How do we make it to where we at least break even and not continue to bury ourselves in future liability? So that's kind of what I had planned to share with you, Stephen. If there's anything else that you want me to touch on, happy to do so, or answer any questions that you might have.
Okay, I have a couple questions, but I'd love to hear from the audience, from the other panelists, if anyone has any questions for Justin.
I see Clifford over there. He's got his hand raised.
Cliff Reese is recognized.
Thank you. Justin, what I'm hearing is that you're looking at each development on almost a standalone basis. Is that development by itself sustainable according to your model? Whereas I would presume that when you look at a community such as Plant City, there is a mix of commercial properties that probably pay more than they use in resources versus residential properties that use more resources than they may pay for. And it's that mix and balance that's important, rather than looking at 1,000 homes. Is that one development standalone sustainable, unless your model takes into account all of those other variables and factors, other than just, looking at 1,000 homes by itself without considering the town as a whole?
Absolutely. And I love how you're thinking about it, because we don't do anything in a silo here. Everything that we do has a chain effect, and it's going to impact how the rest of our community develops. Now, if you were to tell me that 90% of your portfolio, again, I'm trying to use it in terms that we're familiar with. In your investment portfolio, if 90% of your stock loses money every single year, are you in a good financial position? If you're depending on the remaining 10% of all of your development that pays more than what it absorbs in resources, are you in a better position? So by getting down to the development elements and recognizing which, generally speaking, pay more than what they cost to serve, then you can make a better informed decision on what mix in your comprehensive plan, in your designing of your community. Yes, we all need a place to live, but is there a format that allows affordable places to live? Can we make the infrastructure less costly so that we can still provide that mix of that investment to make the whole community better off? So you're on the right track. These questions lead to more questions, lead to better decisions.
Okay, I don't think that quite addressed the issue of mix, because, the investment portfolio is not a reasonable, what's the word? I don't know what the word I'm looking for here. Proxy for this. If I look at my hypothetical town, for every 1,000 homes, I'm going to assume I can bring in another company which will generate X dollars of revenue and employment. And that's the mix that's important, not just does that community stand alone by itself. So yes, you need all of the factors. And if you can then come up with a ratio that takes that into account, that makes it simplistic.
You can. And if you set a benchmark the way that your town has developed today, and you know what your future plan, future land use map is showing for tomorrow, you can make some generic assumptions. We've got 2,000 homes in our community. Thus far, we've been able to recruit X number of businesses. Here's our balance sheet. If we copy paste and do that same thing within a different land mass, is it reasonable to expect that if we do the same thing in the same manner, are we going to be in a similar situation, a better off situation? Again, you should and must look at your whole city and then understanding how those components break down on your balance sheet. If you're predominantly building more of the same that reduces the amount of revenue that you're getting, then you need to offset it based on what you're saying with that mix.
Okay. Thank you, Cliff. Any other questions of Mr. Weiss? Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just curious, the ratio of private to public investment. I'm assuming that what's really relevant from the private side is how much tax revenue is generated. So is the total value of investment, is that really a proxy for the taxes that are expected to be generated by that development?
And this is where the model gets more sophisticated depending on the way that your community receives revenue. For example, in the state of Texas, we have property tax, we have franchise fees, we have sales tax. And depending on the type of development, you could get a mix of all of those revenues. So for example, if you are a single family residential, what we're predominantly getting is property tax. And we are a no income state, so the majority of our revenue comes through property tax and sales tax. And so to answer your question, the ratio is one indicator for how well that private investment, and you can start adding depending on your equity stack, we'll call it. So if you're getting property tax and you're getting sales tax because it's a commercial development that has retail and it has a sales tax component, then yes, you should include that into your model. And we've been refining the way that we've done our analyses as we continue to add commercial and mixed use development. In our particular situation, the type of development that produces the greatest yield on investment is mixed use for several reasons. One, it's vertical. So the amount of land that it consumes is reduced, which means the infrastructure, albeit you might have to upsize a water line or a sewer line, you're not having to extend it over a larger tract of land. And so you're kind of working on both ends of that ratio. You're increasing the private value and you're reducing the public cost because the infrastructure is less costly on that particular development.
Thank you, Ed. And that really touched on the question I was going to ask: isn't the ratio rubric driven, at least in part, by the taxing capability and the taxing formula in any particular jurisdiction? I'm coming from that question. As our committee knows, I'm a commercial realtor, and we're always looking at what those costs are for mixed-use development. Any thoughts about that, Mr. Weiss?
Yeah, 100%. And I think the more that you understand the nuances of your community, the better you are able to apply a principle. A principle is true even if you have different variables, right? The principle is if the private investment is less than the cost to serve it, there's going to be a ratio associated with it. Now, if there's different revenue sources or different ways that you can assess the value of that, then absolutely. That's, you know, for us, again, in the city of Fate, Texas, we actually have one of the lowest property tax rates in the entire state. So what we're looking for is, and there's a lot of reasons, and I won't get into that, I won't bore you on that, but, and that's why one of the reasons it's most valuable to us to have a commercial real estate that also produces sales tax, because we don't derive much of our revenue from the property tax piece of that revenue mix.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, we thank you very much for your explanation and your time today. This has been helpful, and it gets us a long way into understanding Mr. Hollenkap's presentation.
I wish I could stick around and hear the rest of the conversation, but appreciate the opportunity to meet with y'all and wish you the best of luck. I'm so happy you're having these conversations.
More than welcome to stay.
Yes, sir.
I got one last question for you. I'm wondering how using this ratio has impacted your city's relationships with developers and how you work with developers.
In the beginning, it was rough, and I'm very candid about that. And I think it's because they felt as though we were imposing some sort of a criteria that was impossible to meet. When in reality, a lot of our interests align. In fact, if we're able to produce or create an environment in which these type of developments thrive, then the return on investment for these developers is much higher than it is for example, the single family development. So in the beginning, it took a lot of time for us to educate and actually sit across the table and collaborate. So it was helping them understand our balance sheet, and because they're smart, they get ROI, they understand this terminology. So the better they understood where we were coming from, the easier it was for them to adapt their development pattern. And in fact, we're seeing some success right now in our downtown with the City of Fate's very first 3-story mixed use. We're about to announce a sit-down restaurant that's there, an ice cream creamery shop from a couple of local residents, and it's very successful, both from the developer's return standpoint and also from the city. So it can create many win-win situations.
All right, well, Justin, I understand you need to go to another meeting, but thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
You bet. Take care, everybody.
All right. All right, now let's go right into my analysis on the wonderful city of Plant City. We're going to start by looking at the big picture. And that's understanding the current fiscal situation of Plant City. To do that, we want to compare the long run annual revenues to the long run annual expenses. So these are the revenues in Plant City. This is just straight from our city financials. Property tax is roughly 1/3 of our revenues. And what we want to do is just look at the revenues that we think we can rely on long term. So that means we're going to take some things out on the right side, reappropriated, which is just money that rolls over from the previous year. Miscellaneous revenues. These are revenues that we can't build a city upon relying on. That's our revenues. Also, we have sales tax, gas taxes, etc. For expenses, we've got 2 broad categories. On the left, we've got our general fund expenses. That just means services. That's police and fire protection. That's running our government, things like that. And then on the right, we are directly calculating the cost to maintain our roads. We have 152 miles of roads in Plant City. So how often are we going to repave? And what's that cost per mile? How often are we going to replace? And what does that cost per mile? And we're going to take all those costs over the life cycle of a road. Maybe it's 80 years. And then we're going to divide it by 80 to get an annualized cost. And then we get our total expenses. And I'm kind of skipping through some of this because I don't think we don't want to get bogged down in all the little details. But what we get at the end is the profit. And I broke it down in terms of the profit from the developed land and profit from undeveloped land. In Plant City, 54% of our city is developed. 46% is undeveloped. What we want to do is understand the business model of what we've already built. So like Justin was saying, if we take that and we just double it to a whole new landmass, we can expect similar results. So we want to understand is what we're currently doing, is it profitable? Because if it is, then let's expand it. If it's not, then let's tweak it and get it right, and then let's expand that business model. Profit from the developed land, though, in Plant City, we're losing 1.6 million a year. Profit from our undeveloped land, we're losing 5.7. In total, we're losing $7.4 million a year. Now, when I say lose, a lot of that is just being turned into backlog projects that we can't afford yet. Another way to think about it is our revenues cover 83% of our expenses. So we're 83% funded. And again, Plant City is better than any city I've ever looked at or ever seen analysis done on, but we still have a problem. Now, if we wanted to take this negative 7.4 million a year and we wanted to divvy it up amongst all parcels in Plant City, how would we do that? Well, remember our revenues, we've got property taxes, that's category 1, and then we have our other revenues, sales taxes, gas taxes, etc. How to divvy these up? Property taxes, we're going to divvy up per parcel. This one's easy. Every property pays property tax to the city. This is public data. So we just assign everyone's property taxes to each parcel. And then for other revenues, we do it on a per unit basis. We both have homes. It doesn't matter how much acreage my home takes up or your home takes up. We both have homes. We both pay gas taxes. And so we're just going to say other revenues are sprinkled throughout the city on a per unit basis. And the Hillsborough County Property Appraiser's data includes the number of units per home. So a single family home has 1, a duplex has 2, etc. If we take just the property taxes, most of you guys have seen this chart already, but if we take just the property taxes and we divvy them up amongst all parcels on a per acre basis, we get a chart like this. And I won't go into much detail because, like I said, we've all seen this, and I want to keep this conversation moving. Now we're going to go over expenses. We have our 2 categories: service costs, police and fire and running the government, and street costs, the long-term maintenance of our streets. Here's how we divvy those up. For our service costs, we're going to divvy them up. Well, there's 2 ways to do it. We could divvy them up on a per unit basis or on a per acre basis. The argument on a per unit basis, both of us vote in the election. So the cost of running the election, how should we determine what parcels pay for the election? We just say on a per unit basis, because a lot of the costs are done on a unit basis. Fire protection, we both have homes. Both of our homes could catch fire. So there's a good justification to say service costs should be divvied up on a per unit basis. But a lot of our costs, managing our sidewalks, replacing and maintaining our pipes, a lot of these things are done on a per acre basis or on a per foot basis. So if you have a home that's 1 acre and I have a home that's half an acre, you should pay twice as much of the costs for many of our service costs because your home takes up more space, more sidewalk, more water pipes, more sewer pipes, etc. It also takes police and fire twice as long to go by your home than my home. And so there's justification for both. So we divide it down the middle, 50% on a per unit basis, 50% on a per acre basis. Street costs are divvied up on a per acre basis. Bigger lots account or pay for more of the street cost. When you take those expenses and you divvy them up amongst all parcels in Plant City, you get a chart that looks like this. And when you take the difference between the property tax revenues plus all the other revenues, sales taxes, etc., and you minus all the expenses, you get a profit per acre. If you add up all the greens and you subtract all the reds, you're going to get back to that negative 7.4 million. And the only thing I'll point out here is the big green spires is downtown Plant City, our lovely downtown. But also notice there's a large contiguous area of green surrounding downtown. This is old Plant City. This is original Plant City. This is Plant City built before World War II when we built out incrementally over time. Then on the left half of this chart, that's sort of new Plant City. That's post World War II. That's where we started letting developers build a big area at a time. And you do see pockets of green, pockets of wealth and productivity. You also see pockets of red in the middle that weren't ever built out because developers kind of want their own clean slate land. They don't want to fill in little gaps and deal with maybe contentious neighbors. Anyway, that's a deeper dive into my analysis on Plant City. We'll get back to that later if there's time. I want to make sure we give Urban 3 time. These guys are amazing. And so, yeah, I'll just hand things over to them and let them weigh in. Kate and Josh, you there?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Kate Ryba. I am the COO and an urban planner at Urban 3. And I wanted to share a little bit about our work and our approach more on the revenue side. And then Josh, my colleague, who's our senior analyst and researcher, is going to share the cost side. So we'll get to both things. So I'm going to share my screen right now and make sure. Let's see, you're seeing my vacation photo instead of my presentation. All right, great. Let me see if I can change the slide so that you can't see my cards as you guys mentioned earlier. Let's see, I'm going to unshare my screen and reshare it and see if I can switch it over to the other monitor. Just 1 second. All right. One more. Okay, there we go. I think that worked. Yeah, wonderful. All right, so we create three-dimensional models like the one you see here, kind of similar to what Stephen was just sharing, but kind of more on a fine-grained basis. And our analysis, we try to have a really simple approach in the way that Stephen has described and the way that Justin described in terms of allowing everyone to participate in conversations about the economics of their place. But we kind of dig and dive a little bit deeper into the fiscal analysis. So who are we? We work across the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and our focus is really the intersection of land use, tax production, and the design of the built environment. Our roots as a company were founded in 2011, and our principal, Joe Minicozy, who some of you may have seen speak, I believe he spoke at the Hillsborough County Commission a couple of years ago. He worked for a real estate development company that's based here in Asheville, which is where my office is. My colleague Josh is in Portland, Oregon. And they were really focused on using this gentleman's inheritance to build up downtown Asheville. So you may have heard of Asheville. We're a little town up in the mountains of West North Carolina, and we used to really have a completely dead downtown until Julian Price and the company that Joe worked for, as well as a lot of others, really invested in getting a 24/7 downtown, folks living and owning small businesses in our community. So they invested not only in reimagining how a building could look that had been boarded up for many years, but also they invested in small businesses and helped incubate really the local economy here in Asheville. So we believe in data equity. Our approach, similar to what Stephen was mentioning and Justin, is that everyone should be able to contribute and understand the fiscal health of their place as they're making decisions with their elected officials and stakeholders about how they want to grow as a community. We're driven by data, so all the work that we do, we gather data from our clients, and we work primarily in Esri software and GIS, which is pretty much what every city uses to do their mapping. We're creative storytellers, so you all know this. I mean, most people respond and remember stories more than they're going to remember a lot of spreadsheets and numbers. So we try to, create really accessible analyses using storytelling as a tool. And we really try to demystify tax codes. So you all know this in Florida. We've done a lot of projects in Florida. I'm going to share a couple in a moment. But your tax codes are pretty complex. And we like to break those down, and we have something called Taxes for Dummies that we employ in every one of our projects, where we kind of break it down. Not that people are stupid, but people are busy. And I'm an urban planner. I have a master's in planning. I don't understand. I didn't understand the tax code of my community until I started working at Urban 3 in fine detail, because it's unintentionally in some ways, but maybe intentionally in others, really complex, and it shuts a lot of people out from the conversation. We're really activists at our core. I'm a former city councilor. I was on a council here in South Carolina, actually south of here, for about 6 years. So we really want to make communities healthier economically, and all of us have experience working on staff in city government. So we have that perspective and experience. We also are trained designers, so we create infographics. Joe's an urban designer. I also am an urban designer. And so we not only just think of our communities through the lens of data, but we also think a lot about what does the place look like, how does it feel, and the importance of design and creating fiscal sustainability in the long term. We're also a pioneer in the industry. So we were the first firm, and Josh was a part of this, in creating these visuals like what Stephen shared in 3D, to be able to move beyond the 2D map and make it easier for folks to understand their financial sustainability in 3 dimensions. So this is our team. Joe is our principal, and Josh and I are here, and then we have a team of analysts. We're a small but nimble organization. So the way that we think about buildings in your community is kind of the way that a farmer thinks about their land. So what are the crops that create the most yield on the least amount of land? And so when we look at buildings like this is a project that Public Interest Projects, the real estate company that Joe worked for, rehabbed in downtown Asheville. It was empty for over 40 years and had a fairly low tax value as a result of being vacant. And I'm sure you all see this in Hillsborough County, that vacant buildings really, they aren't giving a great return. So this building was rehabbed into a retail space, office space, and then apartments above. And it increased in value over 3,500% in 15 years. The city invested in, you'll see a street tree, a couple park benches, a bike rack, and a trash can, which is probably around a $30,000, $40,000 investment. So, if you had a 401k that returned 3,500% over 15 years, you'd be in pretty good shape. So this is kind of the way that we think about the municipal portfolio, which is something that that Justin was alluding to. So this is a comparison that Joe created a long time ago in looking at this building and its rehabilitation and comparing it with our local Asheville Walmart. And this isn't to say that Walmart is a bad use in your community, but we look at things on a per acre basis, again, like the way that a farmer would look at crops. And so, and if you look at it in total, Walmart creates $20 million in tax value. That's a big number compared to 11 million for the downtown building. But when you break it down on a per acre basis, the amount of land consumed, the amount of pipes that run along the street to get to Walmart, the amount of road in front of that compared to the amount of road in front of this downtown building, the amount of police service that is required at a Walmart versus this downtown building, it's quite a bit more. So, so the land consumed is more, and if you look at the property taxes and the sales taxes, because that's also important in North Carolina, and Justin mentioned that in Texas, and we have actually mapped sales tax in Florida for several communities, and we know it's important for you all as well. And then also residents, people live in this building in downtown, and then jobs. So, while there might be in total more people employed at the Walmart, but on a per acre basis, you have a lot more jobs and comparing things apples to apples. So we like to think of what we do for cities as almost creating an MRI for them, the way that we can map the human brain and look at the creative thought process and your other thought processes. Can we do that for a city? So this is one of our models. This is Hennepin County, which is where Minneapolis is located. And my 12-year-old daughter could tell you, well, where's downtown Minneapolis, right? So we create graphics that are really easily digestible and easy to understand. The spikes in purple are the ones that are the highest value per acre, and then the green is the lowest, and gray is non-taxable. So you can see downtown Minneapolis, and then the lakefront properties along here, if you can see my mouse, that are high value. And this is a traditionally designed community out along the lake. So we look at the revenue side of the ledger. And so this is another model. This is in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we've worked in about over 100 cities and in 37 states. So we are pretty getting to be experts on tax production across the United States, but also we work in Canada and Australia and New Zealand. We also do the cost side of the ledger. So this is a model in Lafayette, Louisiana, and Josh is going to share more examples of doing the comparison similar to what Stephen shared in Plant City using our method. So you'll see that the stuff in black is net positive and the parcels in red are net negative. And the other thing that we do is looking at revenue forecasting and scenario planning. And I'm going to share a project more in detail of this and understanding, I guess, similar to what Stephen was talking about. We looked at whether it was worth it for a city in Texas that I'll get to in a minute to invest in infrastructure to create a new development, in a kind of more in-depth study than the ratio, and I'll share that with you. We also are working currently with Salt Lake County government, and we've worked in Pittsburgh and Boston on this, with looking at the collective assets that the county owns and understanding where they could dispense of property to create more revenue for themselves and or partner with other public agencies such as their transit agency or schools to be able to create revenue for themselves. Finally, we do a lot of civic education and public involvement. Right now, that's a little different for us. We're doing all of our presentations virtually, and we're finding a lot of people are really getting used to that, just in this format that we're in right now this evening. So I mentioned we work with a range of clients, nonprofits, MPOs, cities, counties, and downtown organizations. We also partner with firms on comp plan updates, corridor planning, transit studies, and projects like that. So this is where we worked across the country. And now I'm going to share with you a couple of projects, and then Josh is going to chime in after me to share a few of the cost projects, and I think one Florida project. So this is Leander, Texas. We were hired by the city to do some scenario analysis for them so that they can understand the value of investing in a particular development. There's a transit line that goes from the city of Austin out to Leander. It's the last stop on the line. Leander is predominantly all single family homes. It's very suburban and really different from Austin. They actually they're not huge fans of Austin. They're just a kind of a more quiet suburban community. So a developer purchased this land. As you can see the train line on the left there. This land outlined in red on the right, it's 115 acres right next to the train station. So the station's here, and then you can see that as a city, they haven't really been doing a lot of density around their train station. It hasn't been part of their ethos, but a community college came in and is building on this site here, and there's another development right here, and they thought, well, filling this in with a transit-oriented development could be a win for the city, but they wanted to understand about investing in infrastructure on that site. So this is the site, and it's really a traditional neighborhood design around a public square with more density close to the train station, some commercial up here at the top in these blue boxes, and along the highway, kind of helping fence in, so to speak, the residential development from the roadways. It's built out over 3 phases. So, so these are the 3 phases. This is the existing condition. So this is Leander in 2018, and their tax value per acre. So you can see that they don't really have a downtown. There are no purple spikes there. So that's because they're really monolithically suburban, and they grew from around, I think, 7,000 people to 40,000 in the 90s up until today. So this is if they built out phase 1 of the transit-oriented development project. This is what they would see in a downtown, and this would be phase 2. and then phase 3. So you can see that this creates quite an impact on the revenues for the city that currently really doesn't have any commercial to speak of. So if you look, we always like to look in the context of the county when we're looking, when we have a city client, and because we really think it's important to be able to communicate comparisons to people with local examples. And so you can see Georgetown and Round Rock, which are their neighboring communities, did build downtowns. They're older places and have a more traditional Main Street. So if the TOD went in here, that was proposed, they would create their own downtown that they currently don't have, and it would take their average projected taxable value. It would almost double it from $275,000 an acre to over $500,000 an acre an average. So these are some of the examples. So we always, again, like I said, like to use local examples, and this is what comparing a few downtown buildings and how many acres of these would equal the 45-acre Walmart in terms of the value. So we also create infographics to help visualize, for example, tax increment financing proposals. So this helps show, yes, the developer is getting money reserved for putting infrastructure in on the site, but as soon as the site, the construction kicks off, money starts going into the general fund, and then they have this balloon payment by phase 3, and it allowed the city councilors to really be able to simply understand how the revenues would flow from the project. We also created these visuals so they could see the different phases and how that would affect revenues over time. And so one of the councilors was really interested in a simpler approach of creating a power center with a Best Buy and a Costco and that kind of development. It's close to the highway, and they were really interested to understand how that would compare to the proposed development. And so we created a scenario so they could see the difference. So if you look, obviously just visually, you can see that there's quite a significant difference. It's about $60 million in taxable value for that kind of development versus $733 million at full build out. So, even if we're more than 50% wrong, there's still a lot more taxable value that will be created by investing in the infrastructure for this type of development. In Gainesville, Florida, we were hired by their community redevelopment agency in 2017, 2018, and the city to look at kind of the value of their CRA. They were in negotiations with the county to think about how the structure of the CRA, and they wanted real data to understand how they were performing within the city and within the county from an economic standpoint. So this is the entire county of Alachua County. You can see that Gainesville is kind of the powerhouse in the center of the county. And then this is just the city isolated within the county, and the large gray right there in the middle is University of Florida. And you can see this little red spike here is actually a fraternity that got kicked off of campus and became a taxable parcel. We were trying to figure out what that was, and that in our research discovered that. But the CRA partnered with the university to help build taxable development along the edge, and you can see that the fruits of that paying off with the purple spikes around the campus. We came into the city kind of at an interesting time. The planning director, or the city manager, had renamed the Department of Planning the Department of Doing, and they were really interested in having a different approach to understanding the development and the work of the CRA. I believe this is an animation. So we also, again, we just like to employ lots of different visual techniques because, some people will really respond to understanding the context of comparing the Walmart to the downtown building. Others really resonate with looking at the models. So we are kind of try lots of different techniques to be able to allow people to understand the impact of different types of development within their community. I'm going to skip ahead on this. So one thing we did, and this is my last few slides, is we looked at the different CRA districts, and the one outlined in blue, University Heights, Their growth, we looked at the growth over time because that was really interesting to the CRA. They wanted to know what their impact was with the development that they were helping bring about. And so you see a 19% growth within the University Heights area, about a 25% growth in the northern Fifth Avenue area. Downtown is the highest at 43%. And then unfortunately the east side, which is actually the largest CRA district, at -3%. And that was a little bit, they were sad about that. But then when we looked at, growth citywide of all the parcels and their taxable revenue from 2007 to 2016, they actually were at -3% as well. So that kind of puts it into context. And they were doing better than the county, and the county's taxable revenue growth over time per acre at -5. So I'll leave it at that with the revenue projects. We partner a lot with consulting firms, and this is just a quote from a client of ours. We worked in Ogden, Utah, and their mayor really was able to change his relationship with the county and how they did development together through our work. This is a quote from the city manager and Leander, assistant city manager, about how their council was able to make a data-driven decision about the fiscal impact of this new development using our work. And then finally, we work with nonprofits. We did a really interesting analysis that Josh did in Charleston, in conjunction with their community loan fund focused on affordable housing. Our work is in several different books. I really recommend, especially the one all the way to the left, Charles Marone's Strong Towns. Really, really wonderful book and approach. And if you haven't looked at their website, please do, strongtowns.org. They have new content every day about kind of small incremental ways to create more fiscally strong places to live. And finally, this is my information. I'll also put it in the chat if you are interested at all in chatting with me. Please, give me a call, shoot me an email. And it's just really exciting to hear you all talk about these issues. A lot of times we're brought in to work in communities where the staff is really understanding this, but a lot of times they're appointed folks and elected officials aren't as interested in it, in grappling with these hard conversations. And it's really inspiring to hear you all and the nuanced questions that you're asking. And we're big municipal finance geeks, so it's always fun for me to be able to be a part of these kinds of conversations. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and then we can have Q&A after. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kate, very much. It's very informative. Josh, you're on.
So far, we can hear you.
You might be muted. Josh, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay, there we go. I had called in and I hung that one up. So now I think you can hear me.
Good. Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome.
And now can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. And it's a big sign that says geo accounting.
Yep.
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Okay, so yeah, primarily I'm going to talk about the cost projects we've done, very much in line with what we've heard in Fate and in Plant City. But one of the things that I heard come up that I thought that I could help address is this question about other revenue sources and what they look like and how they factor into this. And also that'd be interesting to see probably the closest place we've done to Hillsborough County is Palm Beach, both in terms of size, being a really big urban county, and also being in Florida. So there's the value per acre model. So again, this is property tax we've done, and there's the city. But we also mapped retail tax. So what we'll do, the communities where we work, anything that's spatially relevant, we'll try to map it. In a lot of cases, that means mapping data that no one in that city has mapped before, that no one had thought when they collected it, oh, maybe this would be important to put on a map someday. So at that time, we were doing it by zip code. Now we do it at a tighter boundary. So in the zip code, you can't see what's in downtown and what's out of downtown. So we went into Palm Beach County because the downtown association there in West Palm Beach was having discussions with the city and the county about where revenue was being generated and where services and investments were being made. And so we were able to look at that over time, and having done this in a bunch of other cities, the pattern we see here, it's kind of generalized. If you were able to break that up and really look at it at a finer grain, it follows the same pattern you see with the property tax model. The other thing that we did there that you'd find interesting is mapping the impact fees. So communities in Florida collect impact fees and then their exclusion areas. And this had never been mapped in Palm Beach before, but the data was there. 10 years of permits saying who was paying how much impact fees. So we mapped it, and then we also were able to look at, because they have to keep track of where it's spent to make sure that it's being spent relatively where it's being collected, which is kind of the source of the discussion we were in. We were able to see where the projects were that were being funded by it. So I won't get into too much of the specifics on the conclusions there, except that it's what we found is the denser areas were producing, in this case, just 1.5% of the area producing 20% of the impact fee revenue. But the mainstay of what we want to talk about is cost and revenue, and in particular the cost of infrastructure. So we did a project like this in Eugene, Oregon. We've done a few now, and this was one of the more recent ones. And so when we look at costs, we primarily look at infrastructure costs for a couple reasons. One is that they're much more expensive than people tend to realize. When we look at the long-term liability of things like pipes and streets and stuff like that. And I haven't seen a community yet where I've looked at the numbers where that community is actually able to cover those long-term liabilities. And also because there are a lot of things that a local government pays for that you could turn off. Like it is possible to close parks and have less firefighters and policemen, but you really can't avoid paying for infrastructure, because when it breaks, everybody feels it. So one of the first things we did is they brought us into Eugene because Eugene is doing pretty well. They have population growth, good real estate market. Financially, they're doing fine, but for some reason they still have to take out a bond every 5 or 10 years to pay for their roads, and they wanted to look at why that was happening and how their development pattern was letting water fall through the cracks. So first thing we did is look at how much road do you have, and can you pay for it. So Eugene is actually better than most cities we've looked at, but it's still 600 miles of road. And so that's the scale. I like to show it as like a little parking lot so people can really see, like, that's what you have to pay for. So every 50 years, that has to be repaved, has to be striped, swept, and eventually reconstructed. And so that's what it would look like if you actually floated in space over the city. And so we looked at the revenue sources where they actually pay for their roads and compared it to the total cost liability that they were facing, and we found that they could afford about 70% of their system, which 70's better than half, but it still leaves them with a pretty substantial deficit. So 70% of $50 million. So was that like $10-12 million? So we just made this little map. Now, we're not saying these are the roads, specifically the roads that are actually in worse shape or better for some reason, just to give a sense of how much of the network there just isn't revenue to pay for right now. So how did we get here? Or if you were paving a road all the way to San Francisco, which you could do with Eugene's road, you'd only make it to Mendocino. So how did we get here? This is the animation of the development over time, but I'm gonna skip past that for now so we can make sure I get this stuff. Well, basically what happened is over time, the development pattern started to change and it became more expansive, more auto-oriented, and the amount of road per new resident became greater and greater. So to make that point, since World War II, since 1950, Eugene built 78% of its current roads. So we built a lot more roads since World War II, which makes sense. This is history that we know about, history automobile and highway construction. And if we look at the amount of road per person, we can see that gap grew and grew, which at a basic level, whatever those revenue sources are, you've got a number of people and the money they have and the infrastructure that has to be fixed. So we can establish that there's a deficit. And we also know that that deficit isn't even across the city. And so one of the peculiarities of government finance is that as a standard, roads are considered assets, which is interesting because you can't really sell roads. So really all they do is break and need to be fixed. So they're really liabilities. And so the math that we run, we treat them as liabilities and try to figure out where's the money going to come from to pay for those. And at a basic level, the unit that increases that disparity or works to reduce it is the profitability or the relationship between the development and the revenue it produces and the infrastructure that serves it. So what this looks like when I talk about the cost of roads, this is the amount of road that was built every year in Eugene going back to the 1900s, so the amount of road that got built every year. But what happens is, and oftentimes infrastructure is seen as free or even as a you know, the word that's technically used is infrastructure is donated by developers in neighborhoods. It's like I built this infrastructure and it cost $1 million, but I give it to you, city. I built it. Well, that's good to not pay for that up front, I suppose. But what happens is that 50 years later, and over the course of 50 years, there's all the maintenance costs and replacement costs that has to be accounted for. And by then, whoever built it in the first place is long gone. So you have to hope that that development has produced enough revenue to do that. So what happens is that cost from 50 years ago shows back up, and then the one from 50 years before that. And so we have this compounding effect of the cost of infrastructure that's starting to hit now, and cities all across the country are facing these really dire needs that they can't meet, especially places that have experienced population loss or you know, loss in revenue because of recessions and things like that, or places that are heavily dependent on things like sales and income tax. So knowing that we have this deficit, and knowing that there are differences in development pattern that contribute to it, what we tried to do is we tried to imagine sending a bill to every property in a city that tries to estimate how much of that road network that property is responsible for. So to give an example of the kind of factors we took into account, one of the things we look at is dead ends. Is, you know, conceptually, when you think about publicly maintained, locally maintained streets, these are streets that are quasi-private. The only people who functionally practically use them are the people who live on them. So that's a cost we just distributed to the houses that are on that street. And so we distribute this out to all these properties, and we look at the revenue and the costs. So revenue is in green and the positive, and the costs, the road costs are in the negative below. And we start to compare, does each development produce enough revenue to cover its costs? And so that's what it looks like when you subtract it out. So this is laying it on its side so you can see where there's positives and where there's negatives. So we'll pull it down and you can see what happens, just as the other examples we saw from the other cities, is the compact, high revenue, highly potent development in the core is positive and is carrying water for other developments. And to the question about commercial real estate, also the issue of residential not being as productive as commercial, that's something you see in this area too, is relatively flat, sort of in the middle of the map. I don't know if you see my cursor, but it's an industrial and commercial corridor where it's really very valuable buildings. It's also the only buildings that are producing the retail tax, though that doesn't matter in Oregon. But what you also see is this mass of red. Now these aren't huge deficits individually. In most cases, we're talking about $100 or $100 and $200 deficit of the revenue meant to cover roads and the cost of the roads. But added up, it becomes a 30% of the road network that can't be afforded. So it's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. So we did to try to make this more, and just go back just to make sure that's clear. So what we're looking at here is the revenue minus the cost, and then the deficit on each property in per acre, looking down from the city up. To make that sort of more real, and also give the city something they could practically use and make decisions based on, we took some different development types that are in the county or in the city and put some values on them. And so you can see single family runs at a deficit, and the denser and the more mixed use property is, the more efficiently it uses space is the most important thing, the more revenue that it produces, more positive revenue. And so basically Eugene's in a position where they have enough single family that's not quite paying for itself. It's a little too expansive, that they're looking for ways that they can infill and add more development without expanding that footprint, so they can start to offset that deficit. And of course, part of the problem, one of the big things that you're seeing with that death by 1,000 cuts, is that Eugene, not unlike many, probably most American cities, is dominated by single family developments. It's 80% of the development that they have. So one of the points that this led us to make, and one of the things that we talked about with them, is balance. That our goal in doing this work wasn't necessarily to vilify any one development type or vilify single family, but to point out that too much of a good thing can come at a cost, and that a city needs different kinds of development. It needs to make sure that if that development format is something that it wants to have, there needs to be enough of other things to help pay for it. And then one other thing I wanted to add in here too, because I thought it would be relevant, especially talking about with fees from looking at the other revenue sources. We mapped the impact fees in Eugene as well, and one of the things they've done that's interesting is they've set aside areas and criteria where they reduce or exempt impact fees with some explicit language about fiscal sustainability. So encouraging development that we now know makes the infrastructure, makes the bottom line more affordable. We don't want to de-incentivize that. We're at the same time charging the full amount for development that's either going to expand the liability or not reduce it significantly. And I think that's where I want to leave it, because I don't want to take too much time to make sure we have questions.
Thank you, Josh. That was good information. We do have some questions and some time we have left. Cliff Reeves.
I'll make it quick. This is fascinating stuff. I'm really impressed by the ability to analyze it, the depth it can get into, the factors that are included. I can also relate to the cities you've been talking to. Was in Austin last year. I haven't been in Nashville in 25 years, but I remember it well before the development. About the only comment I have is these are fantastic tools, but to take a little bit of direction, as Rick was talking about earlier, I'm thinking that the proper way to apply these tools is to first decide what is the vision for the the city, the community, the area. And that will then drive how you apply these analyses. Because as I said earlier, not everything pays for itself. You don't need to have single family, cover its costs if there is an adequate mix of commercial, retail, et cetera, that helps balance the picture. So that vision of what do you want the community to look like should then drive how the analysis is applied to then determine what you can afford to do and what the right mix is.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. That's very flattering.
Okay. Thank you, Cliff.
But also, I love this stuff, so it's always great when other people nerd out on it. But I think the most relevant thing that I can tell you about is I think you're absolutely right. And if there's anything to pull out of this beyond the numbers and any specific metric, it's that design matters and that good design matters. And however a place can find its way to good design, the value will follow within reason. And one of the last projects we did before Eugene, we did Lancaster, California, and something that they're interested in is a concept they were calling form-based fees, where what they wanted to do is articulate exactly that. Here's the kind of development that we want and that we know we need to pay for our roads, and they're in kind of bad shape with the amount of infrastructure they have. So it's a real imperative for them. So they say this is what we want and need to get, and if you deviate from that, we're not going to say no, but there'll be a sliding scale of fee that we collect to basically make the city whole. And there's some other tools that they're looking at, like in creating districts where if something gets built and it's not going to pay for itself with that next 50 years, that there's a mechanism to collect revenue just from that neighborhood to sort of encapsulate the new infrastructure and pay for it.
I got a question, Bill.
Well, it's kind of like a tax incremental district we have here in Florida. Other questions from the committee or comments? Good presentation. I can't.
Hey, Bill.
I don't control the screen. Yes.
I got a question. This is Steven. Josh and Kate, thank you very much. We are an MPO Citizens Advisory Committee, and I'm wondering have you guys ever worked with MPOs, and what would you advise an MPO to do? Because we're in this position where funds come from the state and federal government, so we don't always directly pay for a lot of these projects. And so there's this this feeling of, if we don't do a project, then we lose the funds, they go somewhere else in the state. And it's a real driving force to say yes to projects that maybe we're iffy on, because why not? We're not paying for it always. And I'm wondering how you guys view just an MPO advising federal and state money coming into their county. What you guys say to groups like us?
Yeah, well, so these impacts that we see at the local level, they often are made possible by infrastructure investments at the regional level. So the highways built by the MPO and the expansions that happen now, things like that. So it's sort of baked right into the pudding that sometimes even in the economic analysis portions of documents, it'll talk about all the new development and all of the new money that's going to be made by expanding this lane or turning this highway into a bigger highway. And so where the connection comes, I think, is in seeing that sometimes those investments from that bigger level can create problems and deficits for these communities if they're not building wealth instead, if they're building the wrong kind of wealth, maybe.
And yes, we have worked with MPOs. We're actually currently working with the Land of Sky MPO here in Asheville. It's actually one of the first projects we've ever done in Asheville. We're working with the North Carolina DOT, funds from them. the city and the MPO. And so, and MPO is managing the project, and it's a corridor study. And we've done several of those with MPOs, and specifically, oftentimes the city is asking, what will this do for us in long-term revenue? And that's what we'll be looking at for the study we're currently doing here in Asheville.
Okay, I got another question. Our Board of County Commissioners, they recently hired a group to do some fiscal analysis work. And I noticed in the RFP that the BOCC is looking for, it's explicit, they're looking for the first 20 years, an analysis on the first 20 years of potential land use developments. And that immediately struck me as sort of looking short term, and maybe that would be an analysis that might overemphasize impact fees, which are upfront, and maybe underemphasize infrastructure maintenance since the developer pays for it at first. And so that was like my feeling of, oh, I don't know if this analysis is going to be going to bring about the right projects. But I'm wondering what we can do to help the BOCC or tell them what they can do to make sure this analysis is done right, and we don't get conclusions that are misleading or not helpful. Or so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on what our BOCC can do to get the most out of this analysis.
It's there's a few things to think about there. I think you're right. It's a couple of things that come to mind is again the articulating the vision. I think is really important, and having a fiscal element in that. And the 20 years part is hard because it's not a long enough horizon to capture. I mean, maybe one of the important concepts to get out there and really get them to see is that these are perpetual costs. It's not like a mortgage that you pay off in 20 years or 50 years. It's a forever cost if you mean to maintain it, and that's usually the assumption. And so, will it be a perpetual revenue? Getting them to see that, and also, I'd have to think about that a bit.
Mr. Chairman, this is Rich.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think these are great questions. One of the things I would mention is, fiscal impact covers a wide range of areas, not just transportation. However, as it relates to transportation, and I think the presentation touched on this, it's not simply the cost of building a project. It's the ongoing upkeep and maintenance. And so when we put together, for example, our long-range plan, one of the things we explicitly consider is just that. What does it take to maintain the system? We call it state of good repair or good repair and resilience. Sometimes there's different labels to it, but basically, when you put down some infrastructure, let's say a road, there is an upfront cost to build, but then you have to come back periodically and resurface it. And we have to build that into our plan. And in fact, we do that by considering that really the first claim on any funding or any revenue stream that we can plan for. So we prioritize, preserving what we have above virtually everything else. And so I just wanted to mention that to the committee. And I think, you know, this has been thought provoking, but it's not, I guess it's not something that we haven't considered. I would just say that this is a lot more holistic in that it considers not just transportation costs, but you know, the impacts from a number of different municipal or government services.
Good. Thank you, Rich. Stephen, we've just about reached the limit of our time, and respect for our guests and our committee members. Do you have some closing comments you'd like to make?
Well, I want to thank Kate and Josh for coming, and for Justin for speaking earlier, and for all of you guys for coming. This is, to me, one of the most important things that I feel like that's like a little hobby for me. And I feel like it's one of the most important things I'm working on, and it feels like a really tough thing because it is holistic. And so it's a tough animal to tackle. And you know, we could talk for hours about this, and I got a whole lot more to present. But yeah, it's a good time to wrap it up. But I think it's these conversations that are helpful, and I hope we can just continue finding a way and chipping away. I know there's county commissioners that are getting this and are listening, and I think there are city leaders across the country that are honestly trying to figure out, how did we get ourselves in this situation? We don't have nearly enough money coming in to pay for everything. Where did we go wrong? And the importance of fiscal analysis is I think, one, to understand, you know, the types of projects that work and don't, but then to apply them through measures like the private to public investment ratio before we do the problems. Because so often we do these projects, then 50 years later we start seeing, oh, maybe this didn't make sense, what they did 50 years ago, and it's too late. And I think we can find simple heuristics like private to public, or simple ways of viewing things like just revenue per acre. Everything I talked about at expenses and profit, it gets really complicated. And I think keeping it really simple is important. And I think what Cliff said is important. We can't look at things just in a silo of residential developments. There's other types of developments. But I think the importance is, comparatively, we can look at different types of residential developments, different ways of laying out neighborhoods, and then different ways of laying out commercial developments. And so we can get the best and most valuable residential developments, the best, most valuable commercial developments, and everything else in between, if we're doing the right analysis. I think too many times in our history, this problem felt too complicated, and we just said, who knows how it all fits together? It's too complicated. And then we did nothing. And then we found ourselves in the situation we're in today, where we just did not produce productive enough land. So I think these groups like Urban 3, Verdunity, what Josh is doing, or Justin's doing, there are people that are making it a little more comprehensible for people like us laymen, to say, you know, this isn't rocket science. Yeah, and it just feels like very important work that you guys are doing, Kate and Josh, and I appreciate you coming. And thank you all for humoring me by listening to me talk about what I think is most important in getting Hillsborough County to be a great county 50 years out. So yeah, with that, thank you all.
Thanks, Stephen. And Kate and Josh, thank you for hanging in there with you. Frankly, I wish I were in Nashville tonight. It'd be much more, the climate would be much better. So I love to visit there. Thanks to our committee members. This was a workshop for us. We learned a lot. We've seen a lot of good information. And Kate, thanks for providing your contact information. If there's nothing else to come before the committee, we've reached the end of our time limit, and I will call the workshop to adjournment. Thank you all.
All right, thank you guys.